On this episode of Now We Know, we have a special guest for you, Danielle Bainbridge. It did take us a couple times to get this recorded just due to some unforeseen circumstances, but we are so excited to get to share this with you. Here's our conversation with Danielle Bainbridge.
From Sarah Bartman to Beyonce, Black bodies have been sexualized, scrutinized, and commodified for centuries. When the Black body in question looks and operates differently from most others, that morbid curiosity hanging in the ether becomes even more sinister. In the case of conjoined twins, Millie and Christine McKoy, their shared body was bought, sold, traded, and stolen, all in an attempt to exhibit and dehumanize them. To discuss the McKoys and much more, we welcome the former host and co-creator of the PBS web series, The Origin of Everything, speaker, professor, researcher, and author of the recently published Currencies of Cruelty, Slavery, Freak Shows, and the Performance Archive. Please welcome to the show, Danielle Bainbridge.
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. I have to say, maybe you should have also written the book. It was so thorough.
Don't tell me that. Look, I just know that you helped me through COVID. And so when your name slid across our desk, I was super excited. I just thank you so much for your work with PBS. Totally in line with what we do here. And thank you so much for writing this book. I have many questions. Donna has many questions. But before we even get started with the topic at hand, we'd like to get to know a little bit about you. Can you tell us a brief history? And you are so educated and so storied. Can you tell us where you start? Where do people start understanding who Danielle Bainbridge is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, it's funny because we were just doing interviews for the PhD program at Northwestern that I'm the director of, and I often ask the question, what's your intellectual autobiography? And this kind
Mm.
of reminds me of that question. And it's funny because I've asked it so many times over the last 2 weeks of intense interviews, and I rarely ever answer it. So, this is a good opportunity. I think if we wanted to start the story of me, it would start around age 7. I had a very influential teacher in my life. Her name was is, I'm not sure if she's still with us, but her name is Miss Martin. She was a fabulous teacher who really encouraged me in my journey as a young, creative, precocious person. Um, she was the first person who told me that I was a writer, and she also introduced me, even at that very early age, to the work of William Carlos Williams, who was a poet and writer, and also a physician. Because at that age, I thought I wanted to be a physician, because even as a 7-year-old, I guess I had big hopes for myself. And when I told her I couldn't be a writer because I was going to be a baby doctor, which is what I called it at that age,
Cute.
she told me there was a man who was both a famous poet and a doctor, and it was possible to be both. And I think that idea of opening my horizon to what was possible really influenced me at a very early age. And basically, from age 7 or 8, when I had her, when I was in second grade, to now, my biggest ambition has been to be a writer, to be a creative person. I went to undergrad. I don't learn easy, so I went to undergrad to study pre-med because
As one does.
thought exactly, and very quickly left that major in my sophomore year. That track, anyway, it wasn't a major, it was a track at my undergrad, and it kind of was dramatic, and it makes sense because I'm a theater person, in that I just had a realization one day when I was in lab for bio that I wasn't passionate about this. It wasn't driving me, it wasn't feeding me. And so I stood up in the middle of lab, left my lab partner at her desk at her lab station, went up to my TA and said, "I'm not coming back. I'm quitting this major." And she asked me if I could just stay to the end of lab because I've just left someone else with all the work. And I said, "No, I think I'm leaving right now." And so I left. And then I guess this is a story of having a lot of influential teachers. I had a professor that quarter because I was taking an elective class in African American literature, and her name is Salami Shatillett. And I said something in class one day. She asked me to see her after class. I assumed I was in trouble. And after class, she said, "You know, you say really great things during seminar. You should get a PhD, maybe in Black Studies, maybe in English literature." And I said to her, "How does one do that?" Because I thought you had to be basically fabulously wealthy or incredibly privileged to do something like that. And I was thinking, I don't want any more loans. So she mentored me along with another professor, another Black woman professor, Thaddeus Davis, and Tsitsi Jaji, who was my advisor at the time. So three really phenomenal Black women, as well as the faculty in the theater department at my undergrad, especially Rose Malig and Carrie Mazer, and all of them really rallied around me and encouraged me to go get my PhD. So I decided to switch fields. In undergrad, my major ended up being theater and English, but when I went to grad school, I decided I wanted to study Black Studies. I thought history seemed more interesting to me at that particular moment in my career, and it felt like more things were possible in Black Studies than in other disciplines, particularly because of the interdisciplinary nature of the program I was in. Um, and then after graduate school, I was really fortunate to get a job at Northwestern teaching theater. And I have, a courtesy appointment in Black Studies and Performance Studies. And those things have really been feeding my intellectual life since then. And now I write in a variety of forms. I make media work like Origin of Everything, Historian's Take, um, Self-Evident, BookTube. These are shows that I did with PBS and YouTube Originals. I've done shows with History Channel. But I also write creative nonfiction. I just published, in addition to this academic book, a memoir called Dandelion, a memoir and essays about my journey with being diagnosed with bipolar depression and race in this country and kind of the complicated relationship between Black women and healthcare. And I also write for the screen and stage, so short films and, plays and things like that. So I guess that's the long way around of saying, a little bit about who I am.
Oh, I
I
love
love
all of
that.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
especially I mean, there's so much like beautiful context which makes sense as to maybe why you chose some of those passion projects and your creative works. Well, let's go back like just a little bit further if that's okay. Like where did you grow up? How did you grow up? How did your maybe like caregivers feed into the theater child you were and the maybe curious kind of nature that you have?
hmm Yeah, so I am from a Jamaican family. My parents are both from Jamaica, and they migrated to the US in the 1980s. And I was born in New York City, grew up until I was about 5 years old in the Bronx, in an sort of culturally Jamaican or West Indian, should say, Caribbean neighborhood. And then when I was about 5 years old, we moved to a town called New Rochelle. New Rochelle, if you've never heard of it, which most people have not,
No.
so no fault there, is the fictional setting of the Dick Van Dyke Show, that 50s sitcom.
Okay.
So, it's kind of this predominantly white suburb of New York City that has a very complex history of racial segregation,
Mm,
but as most of this country does, but also, a pretty thriving Black and, person of color population as well. But I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly white from around age 5 onwards. And I think my parents, not that I think, I know my parents were really invested in the idea that I should be confident in myself. That me and my siblings, I have two siblings and I'm a middle child, so, make of that what you will. And my two siblings and they wanted us to have a sense of um, self-love. that there was lots of Black arts and culture that we engaged in. We went into the city often to see plays. We went to the movies to see Black movies. Like, I was raised around a lot of Black music. My parents, neither of them is in the arts. They're both in healthcare.
Mhm.
But I think they wanted to support whatever fed me intellectually. And one of the things I was reflecting to my brother the other day that we think our parents did really well is that they never told us we weren't capable of something. Not that they said you're a special snowflake and everything you do is perfect, or they were helicopter parents, but they always would say, if I went to my dad, even at say age 10, and I said, Dad, I want to be an astronaut, he'd say, okay, that's interesting. What are the things you have to work hard at today to be an astronaut 20 years from now? And what are the steps between today, when you're 10 years old, thinking about being, working for NASA, and when you're 30 years old, going into space? How do you make that trajectory happen? And my mom was pretty similar. She had that same attitude of, you are capable of great things. And I think that gave me a really strong sense of myself. I also had family members, not just my parents, but, aunts, uncles, cousins, play cousins, who um, invested in me and poured into me. And I think that made a big difference into the kind of personality I grew up with, which is, largely introverted, but also um, self-aware enough to know that if I work hard at something and put the effort in, I could be capable. And I think that that was a lot of what was kind of the center of my upbringing.
Think that makes sense. Now, I do have one question about how you got into theater. Can you tell me what show it was that was like, I gotta be involved in that?
Just
And
for
what ways
context,
were
real
you
quick,
involved?
Jonathan is our resident theater
Look at
kid,
me and look at my
adult.
surroundings. You already knew that.
Yeah. I
You
just wanted to
already
make
knew
sure we're all
that.
on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what woke up in you, or who woke it up?
Oh no, it was none other than Miss Toni Braxton.
Oh
Oh.
my goodness.
Yes, so this is quite the story. So I'm glad you asked. It
Okay.
was around the same age I had Miss Martin as a teacher, so this would have been around 1998. Toni Braxton was cast, and they say Princess Tiana was the first Black Disney princess. No, Toni Braxton was the first Black Disney princess. She was cast in Beauty and the Beast on Broadway,
Mhm.
and my parents got tickets somehow to go see Toni Braxton. And we were, babies. Like I was 8, so my sister could have been about 10, and my brother then would have been 3 or 4. But we were old enough to kind of be aware and also to be respectful in a theater. I think they never really took us to a theater before that because they were like, these kids are out of control.
Yeah.
But we went to go see Beauty and the Beast. And I remember we were way up in the balcony and in the front row of the balcony, but the highest seat.
One thing that we were talking about last time that I don't think we got a complete answer, and I just wanted to know if you wanted to expound on it a little bit. I was asking about your introduction to theater, and you were telling us about seeing Toni Braxton, and I
Oh,
wanted to
yeah.
know if there was anything that you wanted to share. I think we ended with you at the show, and
Mhm.
then conversation ended. But tell me about that first time you saw Toni Braxton on Broadway.
Yeah, so it was the first Broadway show. I want to say it was the first play I ever saw. So this would have been 1998. So I was like 8 years old. And the show, like right before it started, one of like this, I guess a stage manager from backstage like came up into the balcony where we were sitting and was like, "Oh, Miss Braxton has like signed these and like wants some of the kids to have them." And they were these little postcards that she had autographed for kids in the audience, and they like came all the way up into the balcony and gave them to us. And like granted, we were probably one of very few Black families in that theater, but I'll never forget it. So if Tony is listening, I still have the photo. It's in my office.
Oh my gosh, that is
Yeah.
so special. So
Yeah.
then from that you got into theater performing,
Mhm.
or where did
So
you connect with it?
So after that, I think the next thing I saw was a lot less exciting. It was a West Side Story at the Westchester Broadway Dinner Theater, which is like the suburban dinner theater outside of New York City near where I grew
Okay.
up. And I like had my parents, like me and my siblings loved it, and we had them buy the DVD or VHS, I can't remember which one, of West Side Story, and we'd like listen to it and sing it and reenact it and like do all these things. Then we loved like Julie Andrews movies and the like The King and I and like all these like kind of old musicals we were really into. The first time I started performing or like doing anything with like public stuff, I was 11 and I joined the speech and debate team. And so I
Hmm.
used to do like what I guess back then it was called dramatic interpretation. And so you'd like, perform like short stories or poems or, pieces from plays like monologues and things like that. And that was when I was 11. And I kept doing that until the end of high school. And then in high school, I joined the drama club. I did a lot of stage crew, like lighting design and things like that.
Cool.
And then also like performed in some plays and then majored in theater in college. So it kind of just kept progressing.
Shout out to Tony Braxton.
Hmm.
Shout out to Tony Braxton.
She's an
I love that.
inspiration. I always like have to remind people because I'm like, I know that not everyone got to see that production, but she was the first Black Disney princess. Before Tiana, there was Tony. So,
She
Mhm.
was.
I think about when Brandy played Cinderella.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
I remember that movie.
Yeah.
Never
What was it
forget.
called? It wasn't
It was
just
Cinderella.
Cinderella.
Rogers and Hammerstein's Cinderella.
Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember that as like one of the, I don't know, a Black Disney princess kind of thing. And that movie, man, that makes me want to go watch it.
Yeah. Oh,
That
that was
makes
a
me wonder,
classic.
Donna, and do you know if that was your welcome into musicals as a kid? Because I think that might be a lot of people's first start with Whitney Houston and Brandy.
Hmm.
Like when it comes to non-animated stuff, and we're seeing people that we know pretend to be other people. I feel like it was Brandy and Whitney.
I could see that
I don't
too
know.
because that was like a late 90s, early 2000s and I can't pinpoint another introduction to musicals before that. I do know after that like Hairspray, that was
Hmm.
a fave. Like I could watch that movie time and time again. And yeah, I think those are like the main two. And then you had like Rent that came out probably a few years after that or around the same time as Hairspray. And yeah, I guess those would be the maybe the staples of childhood
Hmm.
musicals that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah.
You skipped to Dreamgirls, but I forgive you.
I was gonna say Dreamgirls is a good one.
Yeah.
But like Dreamgirls is always kind of messy. I don't know.
It is.
In my memory anyway, I was like,
It
I don't know
is.
if it aged as well as I thought it would, but it is still a good time. I still love Dreamgirls kind of uncritically.
I want to shift us into a not so glittery
Hmm.
direction here now, and talk about the McKoys and talk about your book. But first, I wanted to know what brought you to the topic. What brought you to the McKoys? How did you discover them at all? And then what
Hmm.
kept you with them?
When I was a first year grad student, we had a class called Racial Formations, and that class was for every student who was a PhD student in African American Studies at Yale. And we all took the course. It was like an introduction to Black Studies, essentially, kind of course. And we learned about research methods and different kinds of projects. And professors in the department would visit the class and talk to us about their research and methods they use and things like that. It was just like kind of a hands-on learning thing. And there's an archive at Yale called the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscripts Library. And we had to take a trip to the archive for one of the classes. And so there was like all this, incredible stuff on the table, like, papers from all these famous and notable Black figures, because they have this huge collection, the James Weldon Johnson collection, which is all focused on Black life and culture. And you're seeing all these like famous names and famous photographs and things like that. And then amongst that was this tiny photograph of the McKoy twins. I didn't know who they were at the time, but that it was just amongst all the stuff. And I talk about this in the beginning of the book, but I picked up the photograph and in some ways I felt drawn to or connected to, or like I knew these women in some way. Um Even though I didn't know their names or who they were, I think there was something about them to me that felt recognizable. And I don't know why that is. And I still kind of don't know why that is, but at the time, that's kind of the sentiment I had. So I just took out a pencil because you're not allowed to bring in pens, and I started writing things down on a piece of paper, like the date of the photograph, the name on the photograph, and then in the margin of that photograph, it says, I conversed with this slash these persons. I found them quick and of pleasant manner. Both at times have identical dreams. And that to me was very fascinating because I was like, I have no idea who wrote this. Like, who scribbled this on this photograph was probably the person who purchased it, who maybe spoke to them after their show or something and then wrote it on the side. Um, but it entered the archive and became this artifact, and I was curious about it. So I asked the archivist who was helping us that day, Nancy Cool. I asked her if there was more of, these photographs or information about these women. And she told me that there was a collection that they had just purchased on the McKoy twins, and it wasn't even cataloged yet. It had just like arrived at the archive, and they were like, "Oh, we're curious if anyone would want to work on it or like look into it." And so I just started by writing a paper for a seminar, and one paper became two, and two became three, and then, I had gone to grad school to study like late 20th century feminist theater in Jamaica, and that was like what I was working on as an undergrad, and I thought I would continue doing that as a grad student. And then I kind of fell into this project, and got some funding from the Beinecke to do a summer fellowship where I spent the summer in the archive and also got some travel funds. So I was like, oh, well, I hear that there's more stuff on the McKoys at UNC Chapel Hill. And when I went to UNC Chapel Hill, that's when I discovered that the Bunker twins, who are the original so-called Siamese twins, they were another set of conjoined twins from the 19th century, were also from, or at least resided in North Carolina, most of their lives. And as I started investigating more about the McCoys, I started researching more about the bunkers and discovered that they also had a connection to US slavery and that they became slave owners later in their lives,
Oh, wow.
which was kind of surprising to me and kind of odd. So I wanted to look into that, and then other figures came to light, like Joyce Heth and Blind Tom Wiggins, who were also people born into slavery with disabilities who performed in sideshows and freak shows. So it all kind of started with the McCoys. And actually, the image that I just described from the first story I told you, is the cover of the book. So that's that same first image that I saw.
Yeah, there are some incredible images within the book, The Bunker Twins. There was a piece in there about how they were meticulous about keeping records of their
Hmm.
payments and things like that. And there's also some bits about, and I'm trying not to spoil the book, but there's
Hmm.
also some bits about how the McCoys were involved in, well, being traded, right, and being sold and whatnot. But there's a bit about the $25,000. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that $25,000 story about
Yeah.
their worth, I guess?
Yeah, so there were all of these like promotional programs that a lot of sideshow performers, like you would have the show itself, whatever your skill is. So there were kind of like two types of sideshow performances. There were people who were usually born with some kind of physical disability, and that was kind of why they were being exhibited in this sideshow in this sort of exploitative way. Or there were people who did kind of extraordinary or unusual things, like sword swallowing, fire, throwing, things like that. So you'd have these two types of acts, but a lot of them would have these little biographies, especially for people who had some kind of disability, because the biographies also had like doctors' reports in the back where they would say things like, oh, this is a true anomaly, or this person is really actually who they claim to be, that it's not just a performance. And the biographies were often written in collaboration with the people who ran the sideshows, who were predominantly white men. So the McKoy twins have several of these different kinds of biographies that are an autobiography, some of them are labeled, that are in circulation around the time of their performances. And in one of them, the claim was that they were supposed to perform with a certain circus, and this circus wanted to recruit them to, be performers, and they said no, 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 and then the circus said, like, name your price, essentially. And the McKoy twins, remembering that when their late enslaver's estate was appraised, they were said to have been worth $25,000 because they were enslaved.
And seen as property during that time to consider
Exactly.
it as part of, yeah.
hmm And so they, you know, took this number and said, well, that's what we were, appraised for, so that's what we want as our salary. And supposedly the circus paid it because they were such an attraction and such a, money-making attraction for these various circuses. Um, Now, the veracity of some of these biographies and autobiographies is questionable because there are certain facts that you can maybe glean that like there's truth to them in some way because they are repeated so often throughout the various versions. But in other instances, these are promotional pamphlets. So they would maybe stretch or amplify stories for, for the sales. But that being said, I just thought that it was interesting that was brought into consideration that like their performance labor and their former status as enslaved women were considered somehow linked in terms of how they were evaluated or how they were paid or compensated. And I think a lot of what I'm discussing in the book kind of centers around the question of labor and value. Because I think oftentimes when people think of both freak show or, these kinds of exploitative performances, and also when they think of enslavement, they think of it in terms of like more not objectifying, but less about the person themselves and what value they had in these different systems. So I think one of the things that like I wanted to bring to light was like slavery was as much a humanitarian catastrophe as it was a labor system,
Mm.
and a way of extracting labor from certain people with without pay and through torture, essentially. Whereas in Freakman, in some ways, has similar like coercive mechanisms that it deployed to get labor from people for these shows. Like, these shows were a workplace for the McCoys, in addition to anything else. And I think I was interested in how after freedom, they use some of the strategies and things they learned from the people who had exploited them to benefit themselves and their family. Like they went on, later in their life to like purchase the land of the first man who enslaved their family. Um, so they had a sense of legal savvy that I think also is something that I wanted to highlight because they were involved in a lot of lawsuits. They were involved in a lot of custody battles. Like, these things were part of their lives. And I think they demonstrate a really sophisticated understanding of how to negotiate those systems.
That's such a like black coded thing to do is take the oppressor's way of treating you and learning from that and finding a way to make it your own and to better your
Hmm.
life and to advocate for yourself. And it sucks because it's like, well, why we got to go through all of that just to, you know what I mean? Like learn something
Hmm.
like this or be able, like that shouldn't have to be necessary. But I love how it's like that reclamation of power to be able to live out their best lives after
Hmm.
the end of the enslavement period. So
Hmm.
that's such a powerful thing to do despite incredibly unfortunate circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, all the figures in the book, they have different ways of negotiating their circumstances. And um, I think that became, my main interest in studying these performances and studying this time period was like, how do people not only survive these exploitative systems, but attempt to either thrive or negotiate through these complicated systems of oppression. Um, and a lot of what I discovered was essentially that there's usually not one answer to most of these questions.
Yeah.
Like, you know, on one hand, I agree that freak shows are like extraordinarily exploitative. They were dehumanizing. They were all these things. On another hand, they were a way that the McKoys, gained employment after emancipation. And I don't think that that should have been the only route to, survival that they should have had. Like, I'm not arguing that at all, but I'm just saying, like, well, um, how do we negotiate or think through those sort of limited circumstances, but also ways that they made success out of those limited circumstances?
Yeah, and it's interesting too that the element of being in the entertainment industry, we'll call
Hmm.
freak shows entertainment industry as well. But right now, if, you, for people who cheer on billionaires, which is a weird time to do that, but
Hmm.
right now you look at your black billionaires or even just your wealthy top of the line A-list black entertainers or
Hmm.
wealthy people, they're all entertainers, right? They're come or at least they came from
Hmm.
entertainment. And I think that's interesting. What a through line for Black people to be on display, expressive, somewhat controlled, and then being able to hopefully tell their own narrative
Hmm.
and hopefully get to share their story. Which brings me to the idea of the future perfect. Do you mind explaining what that means and how it applies to the stories that you told within the book?
Yeah, so I was really interested in other scholars who think about different approaches to the archive and what can the archive do to make meaning, um, either for history or our personal negotiation with the archive or whatever it may be. So, as I was thinking through those questions, it really came up around the time when I was working on the chapter that's about the McCoy's autopsy. And
Mm-hmm.
so the Bunker twins passed, several decades before the McCoys did, and they were autopsied. And after the McCoys passed, their family, who did some interviews with different obituaries and things like that, like for articles for local newspapers, reported that the McCoys had always had a fear of autopsy. That after the bunkers were autopsied and some of their remains were put in a museum in Philadelphia, the Mutter Museum. So, they had this fear of being autopsied and made into a medical exhibit. And they essentially like the lore of the family is that they had like people watch over their grave for a certain amount of time, like guards,
Mm.
and also like had these sort of things put in place so that they couldn't be exhumed and autopsied against their will.
Mm.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about that, and why does someone make that kind of choice to essentially say, after death, I want to not be commemorated in the archive or in the official record. I want to disintegrate. Like, I want to
Mhm.
pass naturally and for my body to disintegrate because they were exhumed. I want to say it was in the late 60s or early 70s and moved by a historical society. Their grave was moved to a place closer to the road, as like, to highlight their resting place. But by that point, there were only bones and like nothing could be, exploited at that point.
Mm.
So I started thinking about like what is it that makes someone want to have control over how they'll be remembered historically in the future. And that's kind of where I came to the future perfect, um which is a verb tense that's like the past tense of the future. So that which will have been, or that which will be, so in the future, but the past tense of the future. And essentially I just argue um that as we enter things into the archive, we are not only concerned with preserving the past, but also preserving what history will be told in the future.
Mhm.
Like, we are concerned when you enter something into the official archival record, you're saying, I want this to be remembered today and 20 years from now, and 40 years from that date, and 50 years from that second date. Like, so you also are invested in the idea of futurity, even as you're invested in this idea of the past tense that the archive has within it.
Yeah.
And it was really the McKoy story that had me thinking about that because I was thinking, oh, okay, like you are and they were negotiating with the idea of how will we be remembered or forgotten. And I think it's interesting that the Bunker's story is much more well covered and well known than the McCoys, even though they were contemporaries. There are several books about the Bunkers. They're in a museum. There's all this like artistic work about them. Like there's a lot of stuff about the Bunkers more so than the McCoys. Um, but I do think it's noteworthy that some of that may have been intentional on the part of the McCoys.
Yeah. And on a different level, completely different level, I think about the future perfect and how we interact with that, just like Donna and I with
Hmm.
recording the show and publishing it. And it's the same thought processes. That's why nobody sees the YouTube videos I made when I was 16.
Hmm.
It's like, because I'm on that future perfect. Don't play with me. You know what I mean? And it's interesting how we're so faced with that now because back then you weren't published unless you did something spectacular. We're
Hmm.
publishing ourselves constantly.
Hmm.
And so now it's just in the work, like we're doing this automatically. These lights look like this for a reason, you know?
Hmm.
It's interesting.
It
Yeah.
is. We are, I think, more self-aware, especially um because like there's just more of us online um than any other, generation that came before us. I think in some ways, Facebook started being a thing when I was in high school because I got my first Facebook account when I went to college. And
Mm.
like now that's about 20, almost 20 years ago. So, there's like 20 years worth of information about like me talking to my friends, like things that you could just see. Like whenever I still keep the account because it's like most of my friends I'm in touch with many other ways, so it doesn't actually matter to have this Facebook. But there are certain people in my life, like, like my high school Latin teacher or whatever. I was like, how am I
Right.
going to keep in
Right.
touch with her? Like,
Right.
I mean, I like to keep in touch with her, but I don't have her phone number or anything like that. So
Yeah.
that becomes like the only portal to that particular kind of connection. Um, which is funny because now I'm like, if she sees this episode, she'll probably laugh. But yeah, we are Facebook friends, and that's kind of like the kind of person I keep the account for. But on the same note, I look back sometimes and I'm like, I was posting like my course schedules, like all sorts of stuff that I was like, why did I want people to know so much about what I was doing? Like, it's very fascinating. It's like a fascinating little archive.
It's fascinating, it's scary, it's concerning, like just to think
Yeah.
about similarly where I'm like I used to use the like on a MacBook there was a photo booth app. There might
Oh
still be
yeah.
a photo booth app, but I
Yeah,
haven't.
there is.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so I used to like take all the pictures with it and it just like, you know, that's
Yeah.
still on my Facebook. It still lives there. Although maybe it shouldn't anymore. But
Yeah.
to your point about just like the whole future perfect thing and thinking about like how our stories are told and that I keep going back to like the reclamation of power in that sense and being able to
Hmm.
have some amount of autonomy in a scenario in which they had almost no autonomy and
Hmm.
or had very little considering the circumstances. And we see so much of that too. It's like, we do our due diligence to try and find reputable sources and be able to share the information and connect dots and all of that. And part of why we're even doing the podcast is because there's information that was left off or things that we didn't really get to learn about until now
Hmm.
or like topics that were just kind of like graced on the surface but didn't really dive into the truth. And
Hmm.
so the the will of the people being able to like retell the stories or tell more depth of the stories and like write their own story and have that be cemented in history in a sense, like that's what's so beautiful to me and a way to be able to just like stand up for ourselves, speak for ourselves and really live in our truth of everything that we've been through and how we're going to do so much better despite the odds moving forward. Um, yeah, I just think that's such an empowering place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree.
I'm thinking about what you said, Donna, and I'm also thinking like kind of well, I guess you said it earlier. Why does it take all this for for us to find empowerment? And then also I'm sad for the people who were simply surviving that they became brave and they
Hmm.
became this thing to aspire to. It's like they could persevere, you can too. It's like they shouldn't have had to.
Hmm.
They like this their only option was to survive.
Hmm.
It sucks,
Hmm.
but um there's too many ways that you can interpret all the stories, and again, like you said, whether or not all the stories that are available are true, it, it takes a
Hmm.
lot. It takes a researcher to
Hmm.
to dig into it.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
I wanted to that point about their bravery and how people are lifted up in these ways of fighting against the odds that are stacked against them. It made me think about modern day infrequent, obviously not in the same way,
Hmm.
but I wanted to know if you had any thoughts to share about how infrequent works now. What groups are infreaked in the larger scale conversations, and um, yeah, basically, I just wanted to ask about that. Do you see that happening now, and in what ways is that happening?
Hmm. That's a good question. I mean, I teach a class called Performing the Freak in Pop Culture that goes from the 19th century to contemporary sort of interpretations of like being a freak or freakdom. Um, so we start with like 19th century freak show and sideshow, and then we go into like early 20th century versions of these kinds of exploitative performances. But a lot of the ways that those shows evolved was actually a lot around like racism and xenophobia as well, which worked hand in hand with ableism. And so, we also look at shows that these were like 20th century shows at like World's Fairs and things that would have people from uh claiming to be from foreign countries basically posing um as uninhibited and savage and all these other things, but they were performing a character for these paying audiences, but these paying audiences were looking and saying, "Oh, this is really what someone from that part of the world behaves like. Um, we look at, for example, like the story of oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name. Otabenga, who was uh a black boy who was kept in the Bronx Zoo for a period of time. Like there are all these stories, and I think one of the things that I highlight in the class is that freakdom is really just the word that we use for difference.
Mm.
Um, so that could be sexual difference, that could be, like difference through disability, that could be difference of race or gender. So whatever we label as freakish is just something that differentiates or is different from the norm. Um, and I think like, it's interesting because I have at the last time I taught the class, at the end of the quarter, I had students bring in modern day examples of like what they think infrequent is or freakdom. And one of the more interesting ones that got brought in was a Doja Cat video for what's that song? Wanna Know, I think is the song.
I don't. Can you describe the scene
It's
that was?
like in the music video, she is like almost like an alien, but she's like going through all of these like various terrains.
Need to know.
Need to know. There
Yes,
we go. Okay.
yes,
I
yes. Where
was
she's
like,
giving a lap dance.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so they were, they brought this in as like an example of like, sexual, like being sexually uninhibited, but also that being read as like freakish against like black womanhood. And I was like, wow, that's
Hmm.
interesting because I wouldn't have picked it. Like, honestly, it wouldn't be the first thing that came to my head, but the phrase has traveled and moved through so many different ways of knowing and understanding that I was like, yeah, this is a valid interpretation. It's not like they're claiming, they were actually a huge Doja Cat like fan, the student.
Hmm.
So it wasn't like a negative critique. It was more like,
Yeah,
yeah, this is how this is read or how people
that's
read
interesting.
um this kind of performance. So, I think it's interesting. It's interesting to see how it's evolved and how people, especially like young people, are thinking about it in different ways.
Yeah. Wow. And I'm not even. I'm not one to stand up for Doja Cat
Hmm.
showing feet in the racist chat or whatever. But
Hmm.
that is an interesting take, and also I think her being a black woman in the music industry. I mean, those are your clearest examples of
Hmm.
something similar to what these people have gone through with infrequent. It's like these are the. Don't get me started. Actually, I'll start talking about girl groups again. It's interesting. That's an interesting interpretation.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like to me, I mean, I grew up listening to like hip hop in the 90s,
Mhm.
where like 90s and early 2000s, where like black women claim being like a freak or freaky or sexually uninhibited as like a point
Mhm.
of power.
Yeah.
Like I remember like loving Little Kim or like Foxy Brown or Missy Elliott, Get Your Freak On. Like, these weren't like negative
Mm-mm.
portrayals of like black female sexuality to me. Because to me, I was like, yeah, they're in control of whatever is happening here. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're the one who has the power. Um, but it was just interesting to see like how this student interpreted this particular video differently. I don't know.
Yeah.
I still think about it because I'm like, man, what exactly is it? Like she's an alien, but she's not really human. She's like, she's like a sexual freak, but she's also like in control. Like what exactly is the interpretation here? So yeah, that's
Wow.
that's one of the ones I think about a lot.
I'm gonna chew on that forever. That's interesting.
What do you want people to take away, like as maybe one or two main points, either from the book or from the research or just even from this discussion?
Yeah, I think like one thing I would love people to take away from the book is just a greater understanding of how racialization and freakment, enslavement, like these are all, ableism are systems. They're not necessarily like these. I mean, they happen to us as individuals. We experience them as individuals, but there are also larger systems around us that I think, you know, need to be explored and you know, deconstructed in certain ways so that we can have greater understanding of our own place within these various like complicated systems of oppression.
Hmm.
And then another thing, like one thing I often say, like as a queer person, as a woman, as a black woman, like I think oftentimes marginalized identity gets represented as this like litany of woe and terrible stuff.
Yeah.
It's like it's oppression, it's this, it's that. And I think would love if people saw in the stories I'm telling, especially the stories of the McKoy, who are the central figures of the book, um, that, these identities are not just like hotbeds of oppression, that they're also points of power, points of solidarity, points of community, points of joy and strength. I think those are important to me. Um, because yeah, I don't wake up every day and like go like, oh, whoa, oh my God, like another day suffering under the patriarchy. Like, you
Right.
know, there is a way that all of my identities form the center of me, yes, but they also form a lot of joy in my life and a lot of sources of inspiration and strength and creativity. Um, and so I'd love to be able to share that as well.
It's beautiful.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think thank you so much for talking with us. Thank you for meeting with us
Yeah,
multiple
of
times. I
course.
appreciate that. And if we ever are in Chicago, let's get a drink. So
Yeah, of
so
course.
happy to finally be able to talk with you. And yeah, this is an amazing story. So everyone go check out the book, Currencies of Cruelty, Slavery, Freak Shows in the Performance Archives by the incredible Danielle Bainbridge.
Oh, also,
Oh,
if you are ordering the book through NYU's website, there is, let me find it real quick. There is a discount code. So I wanted to share that because that is always good. I love a coupon. So
hello.
um, if you go to nyupress.org and use the code NYUAU30, you'll get 30% off.
Hey, that's great. Yeah,
Hmm.
Yes, and we'll
thank
be sure
you.
to put it in the show notes so that everyone can link to it and let the people know how they can find you as well and be able to see more of what you're doing in addition to supporting your work.
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at quirkyprofessor underscore. I am also on Blue Sky, Danielle Bainbridge at Blue Sky. And if you want to like talk to me about the book or have any like feedback or things like that, I'm not too scared to say that my work email is danielle.bainbridge at northwestern.edu, and you could always reach out.
It's
Thank you
fantastic.
so much.
Mhm.
Truly, yes.
Thank you
Thank you so
Yeah.
guys.
much, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you. All right, take care.
You
Bye.
too.